The handouts going around. Hello to all my friends on Facebook. We're streaming this live right now, so all the comments will be heard, all the cheering, all the booing. We'll have to sound like we're a crowd twice its size. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. My presentation is on the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band. And I do have, a little bit later, you can come up and take a look at this uniform, recreated uniform of the band. The history of the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band is one of it's a remarkable story of a group of musicians. They were an organized group of intelligent and skilled brass players who were very religious men from the Moravian community in Salem, North Carolina. The Moravians were a small group of Christians that originally formed in 1457 prior to the Protestant Reformation. They settled in the United States in the 18th and early 19th century. Music was and is still today an important part of everyday life. The Moravian settlers brought with them from Europe a rich musical culture, especially the German tradition of amateur musical organizations. The original Salem Town Band was probably a trombone choir playing the traditional hymns for church services. In the early part of the 19th century, it had a number of woodwinds in the band, and by the mid-1850s, valved instruments replaced the trombones and winds. They had the sax horns and also the over-the-shoulder horns. What music did they play? Well, first and foremost, music required for church services to announce the death notices and to perform in the processions on Easter. If you get a chance to ever go down to Winston-Salem during the Easter celebration, you'll hear some great brass music that starts at like 3 o'clock in the morning.
I actually played in the Moravian trombone ensemble in California that Jeff Reynolds belongs to a Moravian church there. Mm-hmm. And we had to get up very, very, very early for the sunrise services on Easter.
Absolutely.
It started at like 6 in the morning, and with LA traffic, you had to get up even earlier to get there. Yeah.
Well, trombone choirs and bands, of course, not limited to brasses, accompanied hymn singings at outdoor services and funerals and marked special events throughout the community. And the music for such functions, of course, consisted of the traditional 4-part harmony. In 1791, George Washington visited Salem. According to records, the Salem Band played God Save Great Washington, which is based on the music God Save the King, or America. And they also played Washington's Grand March. This march is reported to have been the first march written to honor the president. Later records show that the Salem Band played at a ceremony in 1835 where Washington's Grand March, along with Hail Columbia and the March from Figaro's Marriage, was performed. Now, as brass bands flourished in the early part of the 19th century, groups could be found in virtually every city and town throughout the United States. When the Civil War began in 1861, regiments were formed in these towns and cities, and the militias and of course the town bands were formed. And the town bands were very highly valued as they participated in musters, ceremonies, and parades for these militias, which were, of course, useful in recruiting soldiers. Now, as the state and local militias were mustered into service, these groups naturally brought along, the town bands. And the 26th Regimental Band was one of those groups, but they were not among the first Moravians from Salem to enlist. Bands from the 11th North Carolina and the 33rd North Carolina preceded them. The Salem Band played at home for local benefits connected with the war effort. Serving on the home front was important, But the band leader, Sam Mickey, sought an enlistment with the regiment. In the early spring of 1862, he approached Colonel Zebulon Vance and offered the services of the band to the regiment, and he was accepted into the regiment. Sam Mickey wrote about that first encounter with the colonel. I was sitting in the lobby of the Gaston House, New Bern, when a man wearing a colonel's uniform came in with a loaf of bread under each arm. This was Zeb Vance. I spoke to him and told him of my errand. Colonel Vance said, "Why, you are the very man I am looking for. You represent the Salem Band. Come to my regiment at Woods Brick Yard, 4 miles below New Bern." The next morning, I went down to the camp and was met by a captain of Company C, and as a result of my visit, the band was engaged, and at first it was paid for by the officers. Now, the band was outfitted in brand new uniforms of cadet jean, which is a wool cotton combination material, along with brass buttons. And just really quickly, if you get a chance, you'll see this uniform. We did our recreation of the band. We used the same material, the jean cloth that they used back then, and also the same dye, which is a vegetable dye. Trying not to use anything modern. What's interesting that this uniform started as a cadet gray uniform, as explained in the thing, but you can see how it's been fading. The brass buttons, we weren't sure because the photos weren't very clear, so we used the North Carolina Regimental buttons. So after the presentation, or between the break, you can take a look at that uniform. The ensemble consisted of 8 players: an E-flat cornet, 2 B-flat cornets, 2 alto horns, 2 tenor horns, a baritone horn, and 1 bass horn. It was a remarkably well-balanced instrumentation to which they were to later add drums. The history of the band has been chronicled in depth by Harry Hall's A Johnny Reb Band from Salem, The Pride of Tarhelia. The book originally was published in 1963 and was updated and republished in 2006. It's available on the internet and provides much information about this remarkable band. And by the way, just a little side note, Harry Hall originally had included this history of the band as a few chapters in his dissertation on Moravian wind music. He took that and exploded it into this great book. And the book covers much of the history of the band, and it bases the history on the diaries kept by several members of the band. And it's through these eyes of these musicians that we get an interesting view of the Civil War and life as a bandsman. Now, drilling, regimental life for musicians consisted of playing dress parades, lots of drilling, serenades and concerts for the troops, plus, of course, the recruitment efforts. During the early part of their enlistment, the band adjusted to the military life, which included the skill of playing and marching at the same time, something they weren't used to, of course. And here's one of the letters. One of the most difficult requirements was to keep step as we marched up and down the lines at dress parade. Our natural gaits were very dissimilar, and as our attention must necessarily be given closely to our music, we would sometimes forget our feet. The parade grounds were sometimes imperfectly cleared of all stumps and runners, so that now and then some unsuspecting musician would encounter a snag, and his foot would go down into a hole, causing him to execute maneuvers not laid down in Hardy's tactics. Colonel Zebulon Vance was the commander of the 26th North Carolina Regiment. He had been a United States congressman and involved with national politics before the war. He left the regiment in August 1862 to assume the duties of governor of North Carolina. Vance greatly appreciated the band and asked them to perform at his inauguration ceremony in Raleigh on September 8th, 1862. This is a copy of the music of Governor Vance's inauguration march. Like so many music compositions that were unique to this band, many had no composer attributions, leading to the conjecture that many of these marches and quick steps were written by someone near to the band, probably Edward Leinbach, whose brother, Julius Leinbach, played tuba or E-flat bass in the band. Both brothers, Edward and Julius, played in the Salem Town Band, the band that would eventually become the 26th Regimental Band. Now, life went on for the boys after the inauguration, with the regiment receiving a new commander. The band went on a tour, a concert tour, which was cut short by a yellow fever epidemic which was rampant in North Carolina. One of the band members, Augustus Hauser, who played alto horn, who had been home on sick leave, died in November 1862. It turns out he was the only fatality suffered by the band during the war. Along with the patriotic airs, marches, quick steps, and polkas, the troops enjoyed sentimental music. Themes dealing with home, mother, and loved ones were predominant. The band brought in a teacher, William Hartwell, of the 16th Mississippi Regimental Band, who served as a music teacher and also provided arrangements for the band. You have to remember at this time, there's no printed music, so a lot of this music is hand-copied, passed around from band to band. And you see a lot of these bands, both North and South, winding up with great arrangements by Grafula, but they're all hand-copied. Hartwell actually provides some original arrangements for the group. Now, the bands not only performed at church services, at the dress parades and concerts and stuff, not only for church services, but they also provided music for funerals and executions. Julius Leinbach makes note of an unusual incident that happened in camp in Magnolia, North Carolina. January 26, 1863, was the day fixed for the execution of a member of Company B for desertion. He had but 4 or 5 days' notice of his impending fate, but expressed himself as being ready to meet his God. The brigade was formed on 3 sides of a hollow square, the prisoner placed on the open side with the firing squad a short distance in front of him. This squad had been furnished with rifles loaded by us, the band. Half of them with ball cartridges, the other half with blank cartridges, none of them knowing how his gun was loaded. The assistant adjutant general stepped forward and read the sentence of court-martial to him, which condemned him to be shot to death. Then, to my intense relief, certainly to the one most concerned, another paper was read bearing his full pardon, and he was permitted to rejoin his company. He declared he would never desert again, nor did he. But he was a good soldier, but was killed at Gettysburg. In the late spring of 1863, with the victory of Chancellorsville, the Confederate Army was encouraged to follow up on their success and move north back into Pennsylvania, The 26th North Carolina Regiment was then under the command of the boy colonel, Harry Burgwin, who was aged 21, graduate of the Virginia Military Institute and the successor of Colonel Vance. The Army reached the Potomac River, and the band made the crossing in, quote, shoes, socks, pants, and drawers. Members of the band were convinced that Confederate sympathizers were to be found in Maryland, with Leinbach writing, just as I reached the Maryland side of the river, I stumbled and fell to my knees, doing involuntary homage to that state. When we were again dressed, one of our men asked us to play Maryland, My Maryland. our leader being sick. I was the next in authority, and I declined to do so for reasons of my own. A member of General Pettigrew's staff was close by and heard me. He was seen to smile, and he moved away. And not long after that, an order came down from the general that we play that piece of music. I did not decline again. So they did play Maryland, My Maryland, as other Confederate bands did, to help try to get the Marylanders on their side, but most of those Marylanders hid in their houses. By June 28, 1863, with the Confederate Army on Pennsylvania soil and preparing for battle, the Reverend Mr. Wells preached a very forceful sermon. And this was the last sermon that was heard by many men on earth. In speaking about the sermon, the drummer Gus Reich remarked, "Did you see Colonel Bergman during the preaching? He seemed deeply impressed. I believe we are going to lose him on this trip." Sadly, prophetic words, they were fulfilled much sooner than any of us had the remotest idea. The preacher at that time was quoting Jeremiah 8-20, saying, "The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we shall not be saved." At Gettysburg, the 26th North Carolina Regiment lost more men killed or wounded than any other regiment, north or south. Of approximately 800 soldiers engaged, 588 were killed or wounded, and another 126 captured. 14 color bearers had been shot down. In Company F, it was noted that every soldier was shot down, with 33 killed and 58 wounded, the only case of an entire company being wiped out. The band, of course, was doing their duty, which was basically, when not performing, to work in the hospital, acting as surgeon's assistants or as on the field, helping tend to the men. They talked about a particular thing that happened on the second day. With heavy hearts, we went about caring for our wounded. We were sent for by the commanding officer of the brigade, but Dr. Warren sent a note back with Sam Mickey saying we could not be spared. A short time later, another order came for us, and we went accordingly to the regiment, where we found men much more cheerful than ourselves. We played for some time, the 11th North Carolina playing with us, and the men cheered lustily. We learned afterwards from northern papers that our playing could be heard across the lines, and caused wonderment that we should be playing while fighting was going on all around us. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle of the Coldstream Guards and an observer of the Confederate Army had been sent by Queen Victoria, wrote in his diary, "When the cannonade was at its height, a Confederate band of music between the cemetery and ourselves began to play polkas and waltzes, which sounded very curious, accompanied by the hissing and bursting of shells." Now this, to real quick pause here to go back to Fennell, because it's that quote, when Fennell was visiting Gettysburg, he was reading that in Storick's book on the history of the battle. It was like in the middle of the night, he decided to go out to the battlefield, and he was trying to imagine what it was like to have music being played while this was going on. That led, of course, to the historic recording of...
And it's in the album, that quote is in the jacket notes.
Yes, it certainly is. It's a great quote. And who's he talking about? He's talking about the 26th North Carolina Band. And they were, of course, mingled with the 11th doing that. Of course, after Gettysburg, the Confederate Army limped back to Virginia. The band was directed to play at General Heath's headquarters on July 15th, and then band leader Mickey was summoned to appear before the commander, and he was afraid, deathly afraid, that they would be forced to turn in their instruments for muskets. General Lee sent a courier that we should report to him. With our regiment terribly reduced, we were a little uneasy about our future condition, fearing the possibility that we would be put into the ranks. We obeyed the order with fear and trembling, feeling very much like a prisoner who was about to receive his sentence. General Lee received us very kindly and said he considered our band to be the best in the Army and hoped that we would do everything we could to cheer up the men. We went back to our quarters with light hearts. And this is where Lee was quoted saying, "I don't believe we can have an army without music." We've everyone's heard that great quote. He's actually talking about the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band. The 26th returned to Virginia, where they were to stay for the rest of the war. Once again, they found themselves in the regular routine of Army life, drilling, rehearsing, performing camp concerts, dress parades, and serenades for division commanders. Their new commander, division commander, was General Kirkland, W.W. Kirkland. The band participated in a large formal review on September 11th, 1863. A.P. Hill's entire 3rd Corps paraded in review for General Lee. The review was of 30,000 men, also included 17 bands, and took 2 hours for all the troops to pass and review. Now, drilling large groups of troops was no mean feat, and bugle calls, knew we would get to bugle calls, right? Knew it. Knowing me, we're going to get to bugle calls. Bugle calls were important, not only for the telling of time of duties in camp, but also for maneuvering troops on the battlefield. Now, the band, for the most part, was exempt from field music, because bugling is field music, along with the fifes and the drums. The bands were, completely different. But in this regiment, the band was called upon to do some bugling, and the call came from above to provide a cornet player to sound the bugle calls. Now, Julius Leinbach talks about what happened. General Kirkland took a new freak into his head. He sent for Sam and told him he wanted one of us to blow calls for brigade drill. I was selected for the job. This is Julius Leinbach, the E-flat bass player, who also played cornet. I was sent a copy of tactics in which the various calls were given, and I was to memorize a few, but there were so many and I could not know what commands he would give that I was much in the condition of a small boy going to school without knowing my lessons. I had this consolation, however, that if I didn't know the different calls, neither did the general nor the men, so if I gave a wrong one, no one would be the wiser. So I put up a bold front as I walked up to headquarters at the appointed hour. I was put on a fiery steed and followed the general as he rode to the parade grounds. I could well imagine what the under officers and men were thinking as to what sort of circus performance was about to come off. The general gave his command, as for instance, "By battalion, right wheel," which was repeated by the regimental and company officers, and instead of saying "march," I was to give the prescribed call. Mostly I knew no more than the various stunts in the ranks as to which tones I should play, but I blasted out something all the same, and it answered the purpose. For 2 hours, this farce was kept up, and then we rode back to camp, wiser men. I was never asked to repeat the performance. In the fall of '64 and the spring of '65, the band found itself working, of course, hospital duties and caring for the wounded and the dying, assisting surgeons in amputations, and charged with the task of helping maintain ambulance service to the constantly shifting battlefields. They were kept pretty busy. On numerous occasions, they were ordered to the front to play for the troops. By the way, one of the band members said, by the end of the war, I could amputate a leg as well as any other doctor. The band, along with the regiment, settled near Petersburg, and it was monotonous routine again for the Army, with the band playing and practicing. Not yet. Yeah, it's a long one. And of course, in the spring, March of '65, the band found themselves in the breastworks surrounding Petersburg, where they were informed to gather their few belongings and move quickly to the rear. Dan, the tenor player, and I had just gotten to the foot of the tree when a mini ball struck above our heads. I jumped up and said, "Boys, let's get out of here." Then someone said, "The Yankees are coming." And sure enough, a long blue line sparkling with flashes of musketry was moving rapidly toward us, and our men in pitifully small numbers in full retreat. The band retreated with the army, throwing away whatever they could. Unfortunately, they got separated from the regiment. After we had gone a few miles and seemed to have gotten away from everyone else, we came to a house where the good lady gave us some bread and meat, for which we returned our acknowledgments by playing Lorena. This is the E-flat cornet part from their book. By playing Lorena, thereby ending our musical career as the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band, although we did not know it at the time. Someone told us we better stop playing, as the Yankees would hear us and certainly would try to capture us. Well, a few days later, the band was captured. Their instruments were taken, except for Sam Mickey's cornet, which he had hid in his haversack. And this caused much sadness, as they had grown close to their musical instruments. They were taken to the federal prison at Point Lookout, where they were to spend the next 3 months. Then we realized more fully than we had done when we were prisoners, that we were prisoners indeed. That each step we were forced to take was away from home and all we held most dear. When would we be permitted to see our loved ones, or even communicate with them and relieve their anxiety they would naturally feel for our safety and welfare? Where were we going, and what treatment would be accorded us? Sad and gloomy were our thoughts. Farewell home and friends, farewell Southern Confederacy, farewell 26th North Carolina Regiment, farewell 26th North Carolina Regimental Band. No more will we play for your home guard and dress parade. Never more shall your familiar airs cheer and be cheered by the men who for 3 years were wont to call us our band. There is no more 26th North Carolina Regiment. It has passed into history, and such a history as any organization should be well proud. This is a picture of Julius Leinbach. By the way, in July, they were released from prison. They went back to Salem. They reached Salem in July, home at last, and the band, like thousands of other returning soldiers, went about living their lives and helping rebuild the nation. Sam Mickey was a tinsmith, and if you go down to old Salem, North Carolina today, the historic part, you can see the big tin cup. That's Sam Mickey's place of business. The band members played in the town band the latter part of the 19th century. There are great photos of them, and you can see how they get older and older. Most of you know that the Salem Music Foundation is down in Salem, North Carolina. They have all the band books there, and close by is the Moravian cemetery. And when you go in there, you'll find the band members all buried close to each other. So truly a real band of brothers. Julius Leinbach, latter part of the 19th century. Let's go on. And oh yes, that's Sam Mickey at the top there, and of course the big tin pot. Sam returned to Gettysburg in 1913 for the anniversary. 50th anniversary.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The big. Of course, the band marching off, and this is the recreated band when we went down to North Carolina. We had a great time playing for those folks, and they really appreciated it, and they were very impressed with the uniforms. Now, last but not least, we're going to play a piece of music for you, and we're going to listen to the entire thing. Now, hang on one second. we all know Dixie, we had Battle Cry of Freedom, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and all that great stuff. Well, you know, that's the stereotypical Civil War music. One thing that's overlooked is that soldiers loved opera music. They requested arias from operas. So the bands, of course, tried to play as much as they could. They shied away from playing slow pieces, melancholy pieces, because that would make soldiers feel homesick and desert. So these arrangers had the bright idea, let's take these slow pieces and arrange them in a quick step style, making it more peppy sounding. So this Trovatore quick step, this is General Kirkland, the same guy who loved the bugling. When he took over Pettigrew's brigade, he was a fond lover of opera. And he, of course, had been very impressed with the 26th North Carolina. And he presented the band with this arrangement, which they performed. These are three selections from the opera, Trovatore. I'm not going to try and pronounce them so I don't wind up showing off how bad my Italian is or insult anyone. However, the most popular piece in this medley is the Anvil Chorus. And when we perform it, we always like to joke about that, how somebody's got to carry the anvil around when we perform it. But this is a little shameless plug here. One of our CDs here. We have two great CDs, Better Than Rations and Medicine. This the line is from a letter home from a soldier who said the music that he heard in camp was better than rations or medicine. And then Hurrah for the Union, music of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. And then the very famous Day Is Done album. $10 for each one, $30 for three. What a deal! If you're interested, catch me halfway through. But anyway,
20 for Sounds of the Circus.
Okay.
we'll make a swap. Anyway, listen to this piece. I hope you enjoy it, and it'll give you an idea of what the music would have sounded like. In that, all the instruments on this recording date from the mid-19th century, so that'll hopefully excuse some of the intonation and stuff like that. And for those with perfect pitch, yes, we are playing at A450 on this recording. So this is Trovatore Quick Step. Moravians. The band did play Easter. Easter, it was April of 1864. They actually played starting at around 5 in the morning. Surprised a lot of soldiers who did not know the tradition. Wondering what was going on. Anyway, thanks very much, and thank you for having me. Thanks for listening.
All set.